For 3 days, the German Shepherd had stared at the same broken fence. He did not bark. He did not dig. He barely moved. He simply stood there, fixed on one forgotten spot, as if the empty field were trying to speak to him. Morning after morning, people passed the abandoned field and saw the German Shepherd standing there like a statue carved from loyalty and purpose. They laughed at first. Then they grew curious. By the third day, even the locals stopped pretending it was normal. Because dogs do not wait for nothing. They do not return to the same forgotten place unless something is calling them back. And Titan kept coming back. If you believe loyalty still matters, comment below and subscribe, because this story is about what one faithful dog refused to let the world forget. The old fence stretched across a field nobody cared about anymore. Rust covered the wire. Weeds pushed through cracked soil. Wind moved across the tall grass beneath a pale autumn sky. The land looked empty, forgotten, worthless. Yet Titan stood at the exact same spot every single day, his amber eyes fixed beyond the broken fence, as though he could see something nobody else could. 50 yards away, Mason Reed sat on the tailgate of his aging pickup truck and watched the dog with growing concern. At 57 years old, the retired Navy SEAL looked older than he had a month earlier. Life had a way of doing that, especially after a courtroom took everything from you. His savings were gone. His property was gone. His future felt uncertain. The civil judgment, attorney fees, and months without steady work had left him with exactly $2 and a handful of personal belongings. That was it. $2. Yet somehow, losing everything hurt less than watching Titan refuse to leave the field. The German Shepherd had been his partner for nearly a decade. Through storms, through hard years, through every challenge life placed in front of them. Mason trusted the dog more than he trusted most people, which was exactly why this behavior bothered him. Titan was trying to say something. Mason just did not know what. The afternoon wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. The abandoned land rolled toward a dark line of trees on the horizon. To anyone else, nothing about it appeared remarkable. No buildings, no livestock, no signs of life, just open ground forgotten by time. Yet Titan remained motionless. A local farmer eventually pulled his truck onto the shoulder and stepped out. "Your dog still out there?" Mason nodded. Third day. The farmer shook his head. "That field has been empty for years." Mason looked toward Titan. "Maybe." The farmer followed his gaze. "You think he found something?" Mason answered honestly. "I think he believes he did." Silence settled between them. Across the field, Titan finally moved. The German Shepherd took several slow steps forward, then stopped again. His ears lifted. His posture stiffened. Every muscle in his body focused toward something hidden beyond the fence line. Mason immediately stood. The farmer noticed it too. Neither man spoke. They simply watched. Titan lowered his nose toward the ground and walked several feet farther. Then he stopped at a weathered fence post leaning at an angle beneath years of neglect. The dog stared at it. Not the field. Not the trees. The fence post itself. Mason felt a strange sensation settle into his chest. The kind of feeling he learned to trust during years of military service. Instinct. The sense that something important waited just beyond understanding. He climbed down from the truck and started walking toward the field. Tall grass brushed against his boots. Wind moved across the land. Titan never looked away from the old fence post. As Mason approached, he noticed something unusual near its base. Barely visible beneath weeds and dirt. A small piece of metal protruded from the soil. Rusted. Forgotten. Hidden. Mason slowed to a stop. Titan sat beside the post and looked up at him. Calm. Certain. Patient. As if he had been waiting 3 days for this exact moment. And standing there beneath the fading afternoon sun, staring at a piece of buried metal in a field nobody wanted, Mason realized the dog had not brought him here to remember what he had lost. The dog had brought him here to find something. 3 weeks earlier, before Titan refused to leave the broken fence. And before Mason Reed brushed dirt from the piece of buried metal beneath the weeds, the retired Navy SEAL walked out of a courthouse carrying everything he still owned in a small cardboard box. The autumn sky above the city looked cold and colorless. Wind pushed fallen leaves across the courthouse steps. Lawyers hurried toward waiting cars. Reporters packed away cameras. Life moved forward for everyone except the man standing alone near the entrance. Mason reached into his pocket and counted his money for the third time. 2 $1 bills. Not 200. not 20. 2. The number felt almost insulting. Years of work. Years of sacrifice. Years spent building a life. Gone. He stood there for several moments staring at the bills before folding them carefully and returning them to his pocket. Nearby, Titan waited beside a bench. The German shepherd watched the crowd with calm amber eyes. The dog did not understand court decisions. He did not understand paperwork. He only understood people. And right now, he understood that something inside Mason hurt. The retired Navy SEAL walked across the parking lot and opened the passenger door of an aging pickup truck. Most of his remaining belongings already filled the back seat. A duffel bag, several boxes, old photographs, a few pieces of clothing. Enough to fit into a single vehicle, not enough to fill a life. Titan jumped inside and settled into his usual spot. Mason climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. He had no real destination, no reliable plan, just a road stretching ahead and a dog who refused to leave him. Rain began falling before sunset. Thin at first, then steady. The highway disappeared beneath gray skies as miles rolled past. Small towns came and went. Gas stations, farmhouses, empty fields. None felt like places where a man could begin again. By evening, Mason parked beside a rest area overlooking a river. Water moved slowly through the fading light. Trees lined the opposite bank. The world felt quiet. Too quiet. He sat behind the wheel and stared through the windshield. For the first time in years, uncertainty frightened him. Not because of himself. Because of Titan. Titan deserved better than sleeping in a truck. Better than watching his owner lose everything. Titan lifted his head and rested it gently against Mason's arm. The simple gesture broke something loose inside him. Not anger. Not self-pity. Something heavier. Exhaustion. He scratched behind the dog's ears and laughed quietly. You still think I know what I am doing, don't you? Titan's tail tapped softly against the seat. The next several days blurred together. Cheap coffee. Long drives. Temporary work where he could find it. Nights spent in parking lots or rest areas. Every morning began with uncertainty. Every evening ended the same way. Yet through it all, Titan remained steady, loyal, unshaken. One afternoon, while driving through rural Oregon, Mason pulled over beside an abandoned roadside overlook. The valley below stretched toward distant hills covered in fading autumn colors. Titan jumped from the truck and stood beside the railing. Wind moved through his fur. For several minutes the dog simply stared across the landscape. Then he looked back toward Mason. The retired Navy SEAL followed his gaze. Beyond the hills lay open farmland and forgotten roads. Places most people never noticed. Places where secrets could sleep for years. At the time, neither of them knew that somewhere beyond that horizon waited an abandoned field, a broken fence, and a discovery that would change everything. All Mason knew was that he still had $2 in his pocket and one loyal German shepherd walking beside him. Somehow, for the moment, that was enough. For nearly a week, Mason, Reed, and Titan drifted through rural Oregon with no clear destination and no safety net. The retired Navy SEAL picked up temporary jobs wherever he could find them. Loading supplies, repairing fences, cleaning storage buildings. The work paid little, but little was still more than $2. Every evening ended the same way. An aging pickup truck parked beneath an open sky. Titan curled beside him. Then they arrived in Willow Creek. The town sat between rolling farmland and distant hills painted gold by autumn. Most people drove through without stopping. One gas station, one diner, one hardware store, a handful of weathered buildings lining a quiet main road. Yet something about the place felt peaceful. Mason stopped for coffee, directions, and a few minutes of warmth. The owner of the diner noticed the dog immediately. Beautiful dog, the owner said. Mason smiled. He keeps me honest. The woman laughed and refilled his coffee. Through the diner window, Titan sat outside beneath a maple tree watching the street. His amber eyes tracked every passing vehicle, every movement, every sound. The German shepherd looked completely at home despite having no home at all. After breakfast, Mason spent the morning helping a local rancher repair fencing damage during a recent storm. The pay was modest but fair. More importantly, it kept his hands busy. The rancher eventually pointed toward a stretch of abandoned land beyond the northern edge of town. Nobody goes out there anymore. Mason followed his gaze. The field stretched toward distant trees beneath a wide open sky. Weeds covered most of the property. Broken fencing cut across the landscape at odd angles. The place looked forgotten. What happened? He asked. The rancher shrugged. Depends who you ask. The answer caught Mason's attention immediately. Meaning? The older man wiped dirt from his hands. Used to belong to someone years ago. He paused. Then people stopped talking about it. Mason smiled. That clears everything up. The rancher laughed. Welcome to small-town history. By late afternoon, the work was finished. Mason thanked the rancher and started walking back toward his truck. Titan trotted beside him until they reached a fork in the dirt road. Then something unusual happened. The German shepherd stopped. Completely stopped. His ears rose. His body stiffened. Mason noticed immediately. What is it? Titan stared toward the abandoned field. The same one the rancher mentioned earlier. Wind moved through the tall grass. Leaves drifted across the road. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Titan remained frozen. Watching. Mason waited. The dog took several steps forward. Then several more. The retired Navy SEAL followed. They crossed a shallow ditch and moved through waist-high weeds. The farther they walked, the quieter. The world seemed to become. Even the wind felt softer. Ahead stood an old fence line stretching across the property. Most of the posts leaned at awkward angles. Sections of wire had collapsed years earlier. Nature slowly reclaimed everything. Titan stopped near one particular section. His gaze fixed on a weathered fence post partially hidden beneath vines and grass. Mason frowned. You seeing something I don't? The German shepherd never looked away. For several moments neither moved. Then Titan stepped closer to the fence and lowered his nose toward the ground. Mason followed his gaze. Near the base of the post, hidden beneath years of dirt and weeds, something metallic reflected the fading sunlight. Just a brief flash. Easy to miss. Unless a dog had spent 3 days staring directly at it. And though Mason did not know it yet, that tiny piece of buried metal was connected to a story forgotten by nearly everyone in Willow Creek. The buried piece of metal turned out to be older and far more deliberate than either of them expected. Mason Reed dropped to one knee beside the weathered fence post, while Titan remained perfectly still. The German shepherd's eyes never left the ground. Wind moved through the tall grass surrounding them. Somewhere beyond the abandoned field, a tractor engine hummed faintly in the distance. The world continued as normal. Yet standing there, Mason felt the strange certainty that something important waited beneath the soil. He brushed weeds aside with one hand and cleared away several inches of dirt. More metal appeared. Not scrap. Not junk. A marker. Rectangular. Deliberately placed. Rust covered most of the surface, but faint lettering remained visible beneath years of neglect. Mason wiped away additional dirt using the sleeve of his jacket. The words emerged slowly. Property line survey marker. His pulse quickened immediately. Survey markers do not appear randomly in the middle of nowhere. Someone had put this there for a reason. Titan stepped closer and lowered his nose beside the marker. Then he moved several feet farther along the fence and stopped again. Mason followed. Another marker. Then another. Each buried beneath weeds. Each almost invisible. By the time the sun disappeared behind the hills, they had located 5. The markers formed a line stretching across the abandoned property. A boundary. A forgotten boundary. Mason stood quietly and looked across the field. The land seemed larger now. Different. Not abandoned, exactly. Hidden. And that distinction mattered. That night, he parked his truck near the edge of town and could not stop thinking about the markers. Titan slept peacefully on a blanket beside him, as though he had already solved the mystery and simply expected Mason to catch up. The next morning began with cold air and pale sunlight. Mason returned to the diner where he had eaten breakfast earlier in the week. The owner poured coffee and noticed the dirt on his boots. Looks like you've been exploring. Mason smiled. Something like that. He pulled out a rough sketch of the field and the marker locations. The woman's expression changed immediately. Where did you find this? Mason pointed toward the abandoned land. Silence settled between them. Then she slowly lowered herself into the booth across from him. My grandfather used to talk about that property. Mason leaned forward. What did he say? She looked toward the window. That nobody really knew who owned it anymore. The answer only deepened the mystery. Throughout the afternoon, Mason visited the county records office. The building sat inside an aging brick structure near the courthouse. Dusty maps lined the walls. Old filing cabinets filled narrow hallways. A clerk named Robert spent nearly an hour helping him search property records. Most led nowhere. Ownership records had been revised decades earlier. Parcels merged. Boundaries shifted. Pages were misfiled. Important references seemed to vanish between offices. Then Robert paused. That's strange. Mason looked up. The clerk rotated a faded survey map toward him. A large section of land appeared highlighted in pencil. Nearly 900 acres. What is it? Robert adjusted his glasses. According to this old survey, that abandoned field is only the visible edge of something much bigger. Mason studied the map carefully. The highlighted boundary stretched far. Beyond the visible pasture. Beyond the hills. Beyond the tree line. The scale seemed impossible. How big? Robert ran a finger along the measurements. Very big. The clerk hesitated. And according to these records, it belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hart. The name meant nothing to Mason. Yet the moment Robert said it, Titan, who had been sleeping quietly beside the desk, lifted his head. The German shepherd stood and walked toward the map. His nose stopped directly over the highlighted property line. Mason stared at the dog, then at the map, then back at the dog again. Because for the second time in a week, Titan seemed to know exactly where the story was leading long before anyone else. The name Eleanor Hart followed Mason Reed everywhere for the next 2 days. It appeared in faded survey maps, property ledgers, tax records, old newspaper archives stored inside dusty cabinets. Yet every document seemed to end the same way. Questions, missing information, dead ends. Eleanor existed on paper, but her life had almost vanished from memory. The county clerk helped as much as he could. Together they searched through records stretching back decades. Most revealed little. Eleanor owned land. A lot of land. Then suddenly the trail disappeared. No clear sale records. No clean transfer documents. No obvious heirs listed in modern county files. It was as though the property had fallen through a crack in history and never returned. Titan remained unusually interested throughout the search. Whenever maps appeared on a table, the German shepherd moved closer. Whenever the old survey documents came out, he watched them with quiet attention. The behavior would have seemed ridiculous if Mason did not know him so well. After nearly 10 years together, he trusted the dog's instincts more than most people's opinions. Late on the second afternoon, an elderly volunteer working in the local historical society approached their table carrying a cardboard box. You might want this. Mason looked up. The woman smiled. Found it in storage. Dust covered every side of the box. Faded handwriting stretched across the top. Hart Family Collection. Mason's pulse quickened immediately. The volunteer set it down carefully and stepped away. Inside rested dozens of photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings. Most looked fragile with age. Time had yellowed the paper and softened the edges. Yet one photograph immediately captured his attention. A woman stood beside a large farmhouse beneath a bright summer sky. Rolling fields stretched behind her. Barns, silos, orchards. The property looked enormous. Thriving. Alive. Written across the back were 3 simple words. Hart Family Farm. Mason stared at the image. The abandoned field suddenly seemed much smaller. Much less important. The real story lay somewhere beyond the fence line. Titan nudged his arm gently. The German shepherd's nose settled against another stack of papers. Mason followed the gesture. Beneath the photographs rested a folded map, larger than the survey records. More detailed. He opened it carefully. The document revealed the full scale of the property. Nearly 900 acres spread across valleys, hills, streams, and farmland. The boundaries stretched far beyond what anyone in town seemed to remember. No way, Mason whispered. The volunteer overheard him and glanced at the map. Her eyes widened immediately. I have not seen that in years. Mason looked up. You know this place? She nodded slowly. Everybody used to. The answer surprised him. Then why does nobody talk about it? The woman hesitated. The silence lasted several seconds. Because people forgot. And because some people were very comfortable letting them forget. The statement sounded impossible. How does an entire community forget a farm that size? Slowly, Mason realized. One closed gate, one death, one missing record, one silent generation at a time. Yet the evidence sat before him. The property existed. The records existed. The memories were fading. As the afternoon sun moved across the windows, the volunteer told him what little she remembered. Eleanor Hart never married. She lived alone after her parents passed away. She was respected, private, generous. Then one day she disappeared from public life. The farm closed. Workers left. The property slowly faded from conversation. Years became decades. Eventually, newer generations grew up without ever hearing the name. The story should have ended there. Yet something continued bothering Mason. If the property truly disappeared, why were survey markers still buried beneath the abandoned fence line? Why did Titan become obsessed with that exact location? And why did the records feel incomplete? As the Historical Society prepared to close for the evening, Titan suddenly stood. The German Shepherd walked directly toward the map spread across the table. His nose stopped at a specific location near the northern edge of the property. A small symbol marked the spot, barely noticeable. A square. Mason frowned. What is that? The volunteer leaned closer. Her expression changed instantly. I forgot about that. The retired Navy SEAL looked up. Forgot about what? The woman pointed toward the symbol. The old storage shed. And for the first time since discovering the buried survey markers, they finally had a destination. The old storage shed sat nearly 4 miles beyond the broken fence line. According to the faded map, a narrow service road once connected it to the main farm. Time had erased most traces of that road. Grass covered the path. Small trees pushed through cracked earth. Nature reclaimed everything that people forgot. Early the next morning, Mason Reed loaded the map into his truck and followed the route as far as possible. Titan sat beside him, unusually alert. The German Shepherd seemed to understand they were getting closer to something important. Sunlight filtered through low clouds as they crossed the abandoned property. The farther they traveled, the more evidence appeared that a thriving farm once existed there. Broken irrigation pipes, collapsed fence sections, weathered gateposts hidden beneath vines. Fragments of a forgotten life scattered across the landscape. Then they found the shed, or what remained of it. The structure stood alone near a cluster of old oak trees overlooking a shallow valley, exactly where the faded map said it would be. Rust covered the metal roof. One wall leaned slightly inward. Grass grew through gaps in the floor. At first glance, the building looked worthless. Yet something about it felt preserved, not maintained in any ordinary sense. Preserved, as though time itself had stepped around it. Mason parked nearby and climbed out. The autumn air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Titan immediately jumped down and trotted toward the building. The dog did not hesitate. He moved with purpose, the same purpose that brought him to the fence line days earlier. Mason followed. The shed door hung partially open. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls. Dust floated through the air. Old farming equipment rested exactly where someone left it decades ago. Rusted tools, empty shelves, wooden crates. Nothing valuable, nothing unusual. Yet Titan ignored all of it. The German Shepherd crossed the shed and stopped near the rear wall. His ears lifted. His nose moved toward the floor. Then he looked back at Mason, waiting. The retired Navy SEAL felt that familiar sensation again. Instinct. The feeling that a puzzle piece had finally appeared. He stepped closer. The floor beneath Titan looked different from the surrounding boards. Slightly newer. Slightly stronger. Barely noticeable. Easy to miss. Mason knelt and examined it carefully. The wood carried fewer signs of age. Less weather damage. Someone replaced it at some point. Why? Titan lowered his nose and touched the boards once. Then again. The message was obvious. Here. Mason searched the shed and found a crowbar leaning behind an old cabinet. The first board lifted easily. Too easily. Beneath it lay darkness. A hollow space. His heartbeat quickened immediately. He removed a second board. Then a third. The opening widened. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the dry scent of paper, old wood, and years sealed away from sunlight. At the bottom of the cavity rested a small metal box wrapped carefully in oilcloth. For a moment neither moved. The world seemed to become very quiet. Wind whispered through the trees outside. A loose piece of metal rattled softly against the shed roof. Titan sat beside the opening and watched. Mason carefully lifted the package from the hidden compartment. It was heavier than expected. Years of dust covered the wrapping. Yet the oilcloth remained intact. Someone wanted this box protected. Slowly, he unwrapped the package. Beneath the cloth rested a steel document case secured by a simple latch. No lock. No warning. Just a name engraved into the metal. Eleanor Hart. Mason stared at it for several seconds. The woman whose property vanished from memory. The woman nobody seemed to remember. The woman connected to nearly 900 acres of forgotten land. Titan's tail moved softly against the floor. The German shepherd looked almost satisfied, as if he already knew what waited inside. Mason released the latch. The lid opened with a quiet metallic click, and beneath decades of dust and silence rested a stack of documents that would change everything they thought they knew about the abandoned farm. The steel document case contained no money, no jewelry, no hidden fortune. Yet the moment Mason Reed lifted the first sheet of paper from inside, he understood why Eleanor Hart protected it so carefully. The documents were original property records, survey maps, ownership certificates, tax filings. Every page connected to the same land spread across nearly 900 acres beyond the abandoned field. Titan sat quietly beside him while sunlight filtered through cracks in the shed walls. Dust drifted through the air. Outside, wind moved gently through the oak trees. Mason turned page after page. Each document carried official stamps and signatures, dates stretching back decades. Everything appeared legitimate. Everything appeared complete. Yet one detail immediately stood out. The property had never been sold to developers. It had never been dissolved. Instead, Eleanor had placed it into a dormant family trust, with county taxes quietly paid for decades through a timber lease account most people had forgotten existed. Legally, the farm still existed exactly as she left it. The retired Navy SEAL stared at the paperwork in disbelief. How could nearly 900 acres disappear from public memory while still surviving on paper? How could something this valuable remain hidden in plain sight for years? Titan rested his head beside the open case. The German shepherd seemed calm, almost patient, as though he knew the biggest. Answers had not appeared yet. Mason continued searching. Beneath the property records rested a sealed envelope marked private. The paper looked older than everything else. Its edges had yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front belonged to Eleanor herself. For whoever finally finds the farm. The words sent a chill through him. Slowly, he opened the envelope. Inside rested a handwritten letter. The first lines explained everything. Eleanor wrote that she never trusted the people attempting to acquire her land during the final years of her life. Developers, speculators, investors, people interested in acreage rather than history. She feared the property would disappear beneath paperwork and legal disputes after her death. So she created a plan. The farm would remain protected until someone cared enough to find it properly. Mason lowered the page and stared across the shed. The story sounded impossible, yet the evidence rested in his hands. Eleanor anticipated being forgotten. She anticipated the land being forgotten. She prepared for it. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The farm does not belong to me anymore. It belongs to the family that never knew it was theirs. Mason read the line twice. Then a third time. His pulse quickened. Family. There it was again. The same word appearing at the center of so many forgotten stories. He continued reading. Eleanor explained that years earlier she had discovered distant relatives living outside Oregon. Circumstances prevented contact. Time passed. Addresses changed. People died. Opportunities vanished. Yet she never abandoned the idea of finding them. Instead, she left instructions hidden within the farm records. Instructions meant for whoever uncovered the truth. Titan suddenly stood and walked toward a second compartment built into the bottom of the document case. Mason had not noticed it before. The German shepherd touched the compartment with his nose. Once. Deliberately. Mason smiled despite himself. Of course there is more. He opened the hidden section. Inside rested several photographs and a folded family tree. Names stretched across generations. Birth records. Marriage records. Locations. Connections. One branch ended abruptly beside a name highlighted in blue ink. Rebecca Lawson. Below it appeared a note written by Eleanor. Last known descendant. The retired Navy SEAL stared at the page. A real person. A real lead. Outside, clouds drifted across the autumn sky. Sunlight moved through the valley below. The abandoned farm no longer felt abandoned. It felt asleep. Waiting. And after years of silence, someone had finally heard it calling. Titan returned to Mason's side and sat quietly. The German shepherd looked toward the distant fields beyond the shed, toward the land hidden in plain sight for decades. The retired Navy SEAL followed his gaze. Somewhere beyond those hills lived a family that had no idea a forgotten woman spent years trying to protect something for them. And now, for the first time, Mason knew exactly where the story needed to go next. The name Rebecca Lawson stayed in Mason Reed's mind the entire drive back to town. The folded family tree rested carefully on the passenger seat beside Titan. Every few miles, the retired Navy SEAL glanced toward it as if afraid the evidence might disappear. The autumn landscape rolled past beyond the windshield. Golden fields, weathered barns, long stretches of empty road. Titan rested quietly beside the documents. The German shepherd seemed calmer now. The frantic focus that brought him to the broken fence line had softened. Yet every time Mason looked at the dog, he remembered how impossible this journey would have been without him. One abandoned field, one rusted marker, one forgotten shed. Every step began because Titan refused to walk away. By late afternoon, Mason arrived at the county library. The building stood across from a small park where maple leaves covered the sidewalks. If Rebecca Lawson still lived anywhere nearby, local records offered the best chance of finding her. The librarian listened carefully as Mason explained what he was searching for. Within minutes, she was helping him navigate public directories and archived records. Yet one name appeared again and again. Rebecca Lawson, elementary school teacher, volunteer, resident of a small town less than 30 miles away. Mason felt hope return immediately. The trail was real, more real than ever. The following morning, he and Titan drove north beneath a sky filled with low gray clouds. The town appeared exactly the way many small American towns do. Quiet streets, family-owned businesses, a church steeple rising above tree lines, children riding bicycles. Yet somewhere within it lived a woman connected to one of the largest forgotten properties in the county. Mason parked outside a modest white house surrounded by flower beds and oak trees. The place felt welcoming, lived in, real. He sat behind the wheel for several moments gathering his thoughts. How exactly does someone explain that a hidden farm, possibly worth millions, may belong to a stranger? Titan solved the problem first. The German shepherd stepped from the truck and walked calmly toward the front gate. Mason followed. Before he could knock, the front door opened. A woman in her early 40s stepped onto the porch carrying a watering can. She looked surprised to see visitors. Then her eyes settled on Titan. Most people's eyes did. The dog had that effect. "Beautiful German shepherd," she said with a smile. Mason nodded politely. "Thank you." The woman looked between them. "Can I help you?" The retired Navy SEAL suddenly realized how strange this conversation would sound. Yet there was no way around it. "I hope so." He hesitated briefly. "Do you happen to know someone named Eleanor Hart?" The reaction was immediate. The woman's smile disappeared. Her expression shifted to confusion, then curiosity. "That was my great-aunt." Mason's heartbeat quickened. For a moment, neither spoke. Wind moved softly through the oak trees overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet everything had changed. Rebecca looked down at Titan, then back toward Mason. "Why are you asking about her?" The retired Navy SEAL glanced at the folder in his hands. The family tree. The property records. The letters. Decades of forgotten history. "Because I think she spent years trying to find you, and I think she left something behind for your family." Silence settled over the porch. The woman's eyes widened slightly. Confusion mixed with disbelief. Then something deeper. Hope. Behind Mason, Titan sat quietly near the gate. Watching. Waiting. The same way he had waited beside the broken fence. Because after years of silence, the story Eleanor Hart buried beneath forgotten land had finally reached the person it was meant for. Rebecca Lawson invited Mason Reed inside without another question. The moment she heard Eleanor Hart's name, something deep inside her recognized it. Her small house felt warm, lived in, and unmistakably loved. Family photographs lined the walls. Children's drawings hung on the refrigerator. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains and painted soft patterns across hardwood floors. Titan settled near the front door while Mason placed the folder of documents carefully on the dining room table. Rebecca sat across from him. Her hands remained folded tightly together. The retired Navy SEAL slowly opened the folder. Property maps, survey records, family trees, letters. One by one, he explained everything. The abandoned field, the broken fence, the hidden shed, the document case. Eleanor's instructions. At first, Rebecca simply listened. Then she stared. Then she shook her head in disbelief. Several times she looked toward the papers as though expecting them to disappear. This can't be real. Mason understood the reaction. He had experienced the same disbelief. Yet the evidence remained. Official records, original signatures, property surveys. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Eleanor Hart spent years trying to preserve the farm for family she could no longer reach. Rebecca eventually picked up one of the photographs from the box. The image showed Eleanor standing beside the farmhouse during better years. The resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of the eyes, the smile, even the way she stood. Rebecca stared at the photograph for a long time. Then tears filled her eyes. My grandmother used to talk about her. Mason leaned forward slightly. She did. Rebecca nodded. Only a few times. Her voice softened. She always wondered what happened. Silence settled across the room. The years suddenly felt smaller. Not gone, just smaller. The distance between generations no longer seemed impossible. Then Mason handed her Eleanor's letter. Rebecca unfolded it carefully. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. Titan lifted his head and watched quietly from across the room. The German shepherd seemed unusually attentive, as though he understood the importance of this moment. Rebecca read slowly. Every sentence carried weight. Eleanor explained why she hid the farm, why she protected the records, why she never stopped searching for family. There was no anger in the letter, no bitterness, only hope. Hope that someone would eventually find the truth. Hope that the land would return to the people it belonged to. By the time Rebecca reached the final page, tears rolled freely down her face. She lowered the letter and stared through the dining room window. Outside, leaves drifted across the yard. Ordinary life continued. Yet everything had changed. She never forgot us. The words barely escaped above a whisper. Mason looked down at the table. Sometimes the most powerful discoveries are not financial. They are emotional. The value of the farm mattered. But the deeper gift was knowing someone remembered. Someone cared enough to spend years protecting a future they would never see. Hours passed. Family records emerged from storage boxes. Old photographs were compared. Connections confirmed. Every piece fit together. The story was real. The farm was real. The inheritance was real. Then Rebecca discovered something none of them expected. Tucked inside Eleanor's final letter was a handwritten note folded separately from the others. Smaller, shorter, personal. She unfolded it carefully. The message contained only a few lines. If you are reading this, then someone finally found you. Please do not sell the farm before you walk the land. It will explain everything. Rebecca read the note twice. Then a third time. Confusion mixed with curiosity. Mason felt it too. Why would the land explain anything? Titan stood and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, distant hills stretched across the horizon. The same hills connected to the forgotten property. The German shepherd stared toward them with quiet focus. The same way he stared at the fence. The same way he stared at the survey map. And suddenly Mason realized the mystery was not over. Not even close. Eleanor had not hidden the farm simply to pass along ownership. She had hidden it because the land itself still carried a secret. 3 days later, Mason Reed, Rebecca Lawson, and Titan stood at the edge of the forgotten farm just after sunrise. A light mist drifted across the fields. Dew covered the grass. The world looked untouched, almost sacred. For the first time in decades, someone from Eleanor Hart's family had returned. Rebecca held the old letter carefully in one hand while staring across the land she never knew existed. Nearly 900 acres stretched beyond the hills. Rolling pastures, stands of oak trees, a winding creek reflecting pale morning light. The property felt less like real estate and more like a sleeping memory waiting for someone to call it by name. Titan moved ahead of them through the tall grass. The German shepherd's pace was calm, purposeful. Every so often he paused and looked back as if making sure they were following. Mason smiled, still leading the way. Rebecca laughed softly. I think he has been leading this whole story. They spent hours exploring. Near the center of the property, the old farmhouse still stood. Time had weathered it, but not destroyed it. Sunlight filtered through broken shutters. Vines climbed sections of the porch. The place carried scars, yet dignity remained. Several outbuildings stood nearby. Barns, storage sheds, equipment shelters. Everything seemed frozen in time. Rebecca walked slowly through the farmhouse. Dust covered furniture. Family photographs remained on walls. Dishes still rested inside cabinets. It felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into someone else's memory. Then they found Eleanor's final surprise. Inside the farmhouse study stood a large wooden desk facing a window overlooking the valley. Most drawers were empty. One remained locked. Mason examined it briefly before noticing a small brass key taped beneath the underside of the desk. Rebecca laughed through tears. That sounds exactly like someone who spent years hiding secrets. The key turned easily. Inside rested a leather-bound journal. The cover carried Eleanor's initials. Rebecca opened it carefully. The pages contained decades of entries. Thoughts, observations, family stories, farm records. But one section immediately stood out. Eleanor described the real purpose of the property. Not wealth, not investment, not inheritance. Preservation. Years earlier, developers had repeatedly attempted to purchase the land. They wanted housing projects, commercial construction, and industrial expansion. Eleanor refused every offer. She believed the farm represented something larger than money. It represented history, family, community, stewardship. Mason listened as Rebecca read selected passages aloud. The words felt surprisingly modern despite being written years ago. Eleanor worried that future generations might forget where they came from. She worried they might value profit more than legacy. Most of all, she worried the farm would disappear beneath concrete before anyone remembered why it mattered. Then came the final journal entry. Rebecca's voice grew softer as she read. If my family ever returns, tell them the land was never the gift. The opportunity to protect it is the gift. Silence settled across the room. Even the wind outside seemed quieter. Mason looked through the study window toward the endless fields. Suddenly, the entire story made sense. Eleanor never hid the farm because of its financial value. She hid it because she wanted the right people to find it for the right reasons. Titan stood near the doorway watching them. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the morning light. The dog who found the broken fence. The survey markers. The hidden path. The buried truth. Without him, none of this happened. Rebecca closed the journal and wiped away tears. I thought this story was about an inheritance. Mason nodded slowly. So did I. They walked outside together. The farm stretched before them beneath a brilliant blue sky. Beautiful, quiet, waiting. And for the first time since leaving the courthouse with $2 in his pocket, Mason realized that the greatest discovery was never the value of the land. It was the purpose Eleanor had hidden inside it. News travels fast through small towns, especially when the story sounds almost too impossible to be true. Within a week, nearly everyone in Willow Creek knew about the forgotten farm. They knew a retired Navy SEAL and a German shepherd had uncovered something hidden beneath years of silence. They knew a woman named Eleanor Hart had protected a legacy nobody remembered. What they did not know was how much the discovery would change. Mason Reed noticed it first at the diner. Conversations stopped when he entered, not because people were unfriendly, because people were curious. Farmers asked questions. Store owners shared memories. Elderly residents suddenly remembered details they had not discussed in decades. Piece by piece, the community began recovering its own history. Rebecca Lawson spent most of her days reviewing legal records with attorneys and county officials. Every document, once properly reviewed, confirmed the same truth. The property belonged to her family. The boundaries were legitimate. The records were valid. The farm had never disappeared. People had simply forgotten where to look. One afternoon, Mason and Titan joined Rebecca at the old farmhouse. The autumn sky stretched clear and blue above the valley. Workers had begun clearing brush from abandoned roads. Surveyors walked portions of the property. For the first time in years, signs of life returned to the land. Titan moved through the fields with quiet confidence. The German shepherd seemed completely at home there. He explored old paths, followed fence lines, rested beneath oak trees. Every corner of the farm carried echoes of stories waiting to be remembered. Near sunset, a black SUV arrived unexpectedly. Two men stepped out wearing expensive jackets and polished boots. Their appearance immediately fell out of place among the dusty roads and weathered buildings. Rebecca greeted them politely. The older man introduced himself as a representative of a development company. Mason listened quietly from a distance. The conversation remained respectful, professional, yet the purpose became obvious within minutes. From the polished way they spoke, Mason suspected they had wanted it for years. They offered numbers large enough to make most people stop listening to everything else. Millions of dollars. Immediate contracts. Future projects. Promises. Opportunities. The representative spoke confidently while gesturing across the valley. New housing developments. Commercial expansion. Economic growth. When he finally finished, silence settled across the property. Wind moved through the grass. Titan sat beside Rebecca and watched. The woman looked across the land. The barns. The creek. The hills glowing beneath the evening sun. Then she smiled. No. The answer surprised them. The representative tried again. More numbers. More incentives. More promises. Rebecca listened patiently. Then she shook her head. My great-aunt protected this place for a reason. Her voice remained calm. I did not spend all these weeks finding it just to erase it. The men eventually left. Their SUV disappeared down the dirt road and vanished beyond the hills. Afterward, nobody spoke for several moments. The farm seemed quieter somehow. More certain. Rebecca looked toward Mason. Now I understand what Eleanor meant. He nodded. About protecting it. She smiled. About responsibility. The difference mattered. Ownership was the easy part. Responsibility was harder. As darkness approached, they walked toward a hill overlooking the valley. From there, the entire property spread before them. Nearly 900 acres touched by golden light. Beautiful. Timeless. Titan stood near the crest and stared across the fields below. The same way he stared at the broken fence. The same way he stared at the survey map. Mason placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. You knew this mattered, didn't you? Titan looked up briefly before returning his attention to the valley. The retired Navy SEAL laughed softly. Somewhere beneath the fading sunlight, a forgotten farm had found its family again. And for the first time since walking out of a courthouse with $2 in his pocket, Mason realized that justice does not always arrive through judges, paperwork, or verdicts. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, on four paws, carrying the truth back home. Winter arrived slowly across Willow Creek. Frost settled over the fields each morning. Thin layers of ice appeared along the edges of streams winding through the forgotten farm. Yet despite the season, life continued returning to the property. Roads were repaired. Fence lines were restored. Old barns received new roofs. The work happened carefully, respectfully, not like a construction project, like a restoration. Rebecca Lawson remained committed to honoring Eleanor Hart's wishes. Every decision began with the same question. What would protect the land? The answer guided everything. Mason Reed helped whenever he could. Some days he repaired equipment. Other days he assisted local volunteers clearing overgrown trails and documenting historical landmarks hidden throughout the property. The work paid little, but strangely, Mason had never felt richer. For months his life revolved around loss. Courtrooms, bills, uncertainty. Now his days carried purpose. Every sunrise offered something meaningful to do. Titan became a familiar sight across the farm. The German shepherd accompanied workers, greeted visitors, and wandered old pathways as though he had lived there his entire life. Children from nearby schools occasionally visited to learn about the property's history. Most wanted to hear the same story. The dog who refused to leave the broken fence. Titan accepted their attention patiently. The local newspaper eventually published an article about the discovery. Then another. Soon people traveled from neighboring counties to see the farm for themselves. Not because of the land's value. Because of the story. The hidden records. The forgotten legacy. The woman who protected a future she would never witness. One afternoon, a regional land preservation organization contacted Rebecca with an unexpected proposal. Representatives wanted to partner with her family to protect large portions of the property permanently. Wildlife habitats, historical structures, agricultural areas. The plan aligned perfectly with Eleanor's vision. Weeks later, agreements were signed. The farm's future became secure. No developers, no subdivisions, no disappearance beneath concrete. The land would remain what Eleanor always hoped it would be, a living legacy. When the paperwork became official, the community gathered inside the restored barn for a small celebration. Nothing extravagant. The atmosphere felt warm despite the cold weather outside. Mason stood near the entrance watching children run through the building while Titan rested beside him. Rebecca eventually stepped onto a small stage built from old wooden pallets. She looked nervous, emotional, grateful. The room grew quiet. A year ago, she began softly. "I did not even know this farm existed." Gentle laughter moved through the crowd. She smiled. "Now I understand it was never truly gone. We simply stopped looking." The audience listened carefully. Then Rebecca turned toward Mason and Titan. This story would have ended differently without them. Applause filled the barn. Mason immediately looked uncomfortable. Titan simply wagged his tail. Afterward, people gathered around to shake hands and share memories. Many thanked Mason. Others thanked the dog. One elderly farmer paused beside Titan and scratched behind his ears. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes God sends answers on four legs." The words stayed with Mason long after the celebration ended. Later that evening, he stood outside the barn watching snowflakes drift across the valley. Lights glowed warmly through farmhouse windows. The restored property stretched beneath the night sky. Alive again, Titan stood beside him. The German shepherd looked toward the distant fence line barely visible in the darkness. The same fence where everything began. The same fence nobody noticed until a dog refused to walk away. Mason smiled and rested a hand on Titan's shoulder. Because for the first time since leaving the courthouse with $2 in his pocket, he realized that losing everything had led him exactly where he needed to be. Spring returned to Willow Creek almost exactly 1 year after Titan first stopped at the broken fence. Wildflowers covered the hills. The creek moved gently through the valley. New calves wandered pastures that had stood empty for decades. Life had returned to the forgotten farm, but not because of money. Not because people suddenly discovered its value. Life returned because someone finally remembered why it mattered. The farmhouse stood proudly beneath a clear blue sky. Fresh paint covered the weathered boards. The porch had been repaired. The old barn doors opened smoothly once again. Yet the most remarkable change could not be measured by buildings or acreage. It could be seen in the people. Families gathered on weekends. School groups visited to learn local history. Conservation volunteers helped maintain trails and wildlife habitats. The land Eleanor Hart protected for so many years had become exactly what she hoped it would become. A gift, not to one person, to an entire community. Mason Reed stood near the top of a hill overlooking the valley. A gentle breeze moved through the grass around him. Titan rested nearby beneath the shade of an oak tree. The German shepherd's muzzle carried more gray than before, but his eyes remained bright. Watchful, peaceful. Below them, Rebecca Lawson greeted visitors arriving for a small community celebration. Tables filled with homemade food stretched across the lawn. Children laughed near the restored barn. Neighbors shared stories beneath strings of lights hanging between old trees. Mason smiled quietly. 1 year earlier, he had walked out of a courthouse with $2 in his pocket and no idea where life was taking him. He remembered the feeling clearly. The uncertainty, the exhaustion, the fear of becoming invisible. Yet standing there now, those memories felt distant. Not erased, simply transformed. Sometimes life does not rebuild what was lost. Sometimes it leads you somewhere better. Rebecca eventually climbed onto a small wooden stage built beside the barn. The crowd grew quiet. She thanked the volunteers, the neighbors, the preservation groups, the families who helped restore the property. Then she looked toward Mason and Titan. Her voice softened. None of us would be standing here without two very unexpected visitors. Laughter moved through the crowd. Titan lifted his head at the sound. Several children pointed toward him and smiled. Rebecca continued. A year ago, this land was forgotten. Its history was forgotten. Its purpose was forgotten. Then, a man who had every reason to give up chose not to. And a dog who could have walked away refused to. Applause echoed across the valley. Mason immediately looked uncomfortable. Titan seemed completely unimpressed by the attention. As evening settled across the farm, golden sunlight spread across the fields. Shadows stretched longer. The celebration slowly transformed into quiet conversations and shared memories. Mason eventually walked away from the crowd and returned to the old fence line where everything began. The broken post still stood there. Weathered, crooked, unremarkable. Most people would have walked past it without a second glance. Titan joined him a moment later and sat beside the fence. Together they watched the sun disappear beyond the hills. Neither needed to speak. The story was complete. The family had been found. The farm had been saved. The truth had come home. Mason rested a hand on Titan's shoulder and smiled. For a long moment, they simply sat there beneath the fading light. Then he looked across the valley one final time. The restored farm glowed warmly against the evening sky. People laughed in the distance. Children ran through the grass. Life moved forward. And the retired Navy SEAL who once believed he had lost everything finally understood something Eleanor Hart knew all along. The farm was never truly worth millions because of acreage, fences, or timber. It was worth more than money because it gave people a reason to belong. Titan leaned gently against his leg. Mason scratched behind the dog's ears and laughed softly. Because sometimes justice does not arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it waits patiently behind a broken fence until a loyal dog decides it is time to lead someone home.